What's good, guys, and welcome back to another video review. If it feels like I'm uploading a little bit more frequently than usual, that's actually because a lot of the review items, particularly the IMs that I have, are actually on loan, so I have to get them done in a certain time frame before I send them back to their owners. That being said, today I'll be sharing my thoughts on the Thieaudio Legacy 3 and Legacy 9 IMs. Starting from the L3, which I have right here, this is their entry-level hybrid IM. It is running 2 balanced armatures and 1 dynamic driver. I was low-key excited to give this one a try just because it has a tuning very similar to one of my favorite IMs, the Thieaudio U12T. That being said, you guys know that I never really shy away from calling things bad when they're bad. And sometimes I'll try to put it a little bit more nicely maybe, but I don't make exceptions, and I won't make exceptions here for audio either. And so to be frank, the L3 is just not very good. So starting from the low end, the L3 has a tasteful bass boost that can muddle a bit, but nothing too egregious and perfectly acceptable for the price point. It's actually probably my favorite part of the IM, and it's definitely the L3's standout. Once you get to the mid-range though, this is where things start to really fall apart. Vocals come across as plain hazy, and they have a very boxed in nature to them. It really feels like they struggle to push air or extend across the soundstage in general. I could talk about the highs next, or maybe I couldn't because they don't really exist. I hear them as solely defined by their attack function, meaning there's no decay and there's very little extension to them. As a result, they sort of come off as blunted or dead. Maybe if I was being generous, I could hear them being described as quote-unquote laid back, but that's definitely a stretch in my opinion. Okay, so relatively speaking, this is still a pretty safe sound signature, but the L3 also has massive timbre coloration issues. Someone asked me what I meant by this, and to this effect, if you have ever heard a balanced armature IM, then you've probably felt that there's like a sense of weightlessness or lack of authority to the notes. And this is what people are often referring to when they call BA texture quote-unquote plasticky. It's not a great descriptor, but it's a descriptor nonetheless, and it's sort of apt in some ways. It's the same principle here with the L3, except the whole frequency spectrum just feels sort of smothered, for lack of a better word. Moving on to technicalities, I also don't find the L3 to be particularly good. The transients feel pretty in general, and as a result, it images rather poorly. Now, I am well aware that there is a certain individual that has the L3 pegged at S rank on their ranking list. I'm not going to comment further on that just because everyone hears things differently, has their own preferences, and that's totally fair, to each their own. But to me, myself, I would probably rank the L3 at around a solid C, maybe a C+ at best, given their non-offensive tuning. Now, because I already know that some people are going to say, oh no, what are you running this off of? What source? What cable? What tips? They can't possibly sound this bad, you're doing something wrong. To answer this question, I use silicon tips, the stock cable, and most of my listening is done off of a Shanling M0 with FLAC files. I am sure that to a certain extent you could tip roll with the L3 to have it better suit your personal preferences. But I don't do this because of consistency as a reviewer. I also don't happen to believe in burn-in unless we're talking about your brain and ears getting used to the sound. That may or may not discredit my review for you right here and there, and if that is the case, just move the fuck along. Okay, so moving on to the L9. This is definitely a step up from the not-so-great L3, and it had better be given that it clocks in at around $550, I think. This is what I would consider a basshead's IM. There's a strong sub-bass emphasis, and there's just so much rumble and texture to the L9's bass. I'm not going to lie, it does muddle a bit more than the L3, but I'm a bit of a basshead myself, and it really floats my boat in this respect. Moving on to the mid-range is really nothing to write home about, but coming from the L3, that's definitely a good thing. Vocal presentation on the L9 is thick and smoothed out. Conversely, the treble is a lot more interesting. There's a ton of sparkle, splash, and just life to the treble in general that I really find myself enjoying. It's definitely a preference thing, but I think I like it even more than the bass response on the L9, and I don't think I've heard another IM with a treble this lively. Both the L3 and the L9 are warmer, darker IMs, just in general. I don't find either of them to be very technically proficient, no doubt exacerbated by that darker tonality, and the L9 is really no exception here. In terms of detail retrieval and sheer resolution, it's definitely way better than the L3, which is utter shit, but just in general for the price, I don't find it to be very great in terms of technicalities. Overall, the L9 is an IM that's sort of in a weird spot. It's certainly not an analytical IM, and neither is it a chill laid-back IM, simply because of that boosted bass response and that sparkly treble. That being said, I do find myself really enjoying the L9, and I guess you could call it a sort of guilty pleasure of sorts. While I don't find the L9's sound quality conducive to its asking price, if the tonality sounds like something that would float your boat, I really find myself saying, hell, why not? And yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about these two IMs. I have heard the Voyager 14 as well, and I didn't really think too much of it, honestly. I'm not sure what setting it was on, but it had a fat mid-range suck out, and I ended up handing it back to its owner in under 5 minutes. Just in general, I think Thieaudio has some good apples and some bad apples. I'm really looking forward to seeing what they bring to the table with their new, I think it's an electrostatic IM. As always, thanks for watching. I hope you guys found this review informative. If you did, be sure to smash that like button and to subscribe for future content.